cheaper and easier to do that than it was to knock it down, since it wasn't posing any safety concerns. So they just kind of left it. But back in the early 1990s, in between these bridges here, about the bases of the bridges, they were driving pilings into the riverbed. And when you drive pilings, you want them to go into the bottom of the river so that they stand up. But what they didn't realize is that they punctured through the bottom of the river and into a tunnel. You see, in the first half of the 20th century, there were over 50 miles of utility tunnels dug underneath the city of Chicago to supply utilities like coal, as well as merchandise to the businesses in the downtown area, because our surface streets were so congested. Now, they were actually a tourist attraction for a little while in the 1920s and 30s, but they had long ago been abandoned and kind of forgotten about. So, when they were driving these pilings, they didn't realize that they had punctured through one of these tunnels. But soon, a lot of the businesses in the downtown area started to realize their basements were starting to flood. But no one knew where all this water was coming from. In fact, there's a large glass office building right next to City Hall called the Thompson Center. Unfortunately, we can't see it from the boat. But there's a food court in the basement, which was submerged in about 9 feet of water with fish swimming in it. Yeah, it was that bad and extensive like that throughout the entire downtown area and getting worse. Well, one day, one of the workers in the Sun-Times building looks out the window and notices a whirlpool at the base of that old bridge. Now, whirlpools, they don't just appear overnight. So they quickly realized that's the hole that's flooding the entire downtown area. It took months to get cleaned up and cost billions of dollars of damage back in the early 1990s. Now in front of us here, we're about to pass underneath Lake Street, and this is the second of the 2 bridges crossing the river carrying the Elk. This is the pink and the green line we're about to pass underneath. And Chicago has more movable bridges than any other city in the world. Now, there are other cities that have more bridges, but no one has more movable bridges than Chicago. And yes, every single bridge that we pass under today still goes up and down to this very day. Now, technically speaking, this is known as a bascule trunnion bridge, which is a fancy way of saying a teeter-totter. But around the world, it's commonly referred to as a Chicago-style bridge because they were first used extensively and perfected here in Chicago. Now, on our western shore, you'll notice that there are train tracks over there. And these are some of the oldest train right-of-ways in the city of Chicago. There have been trains on this location for well over 150 years. And they disappear underneath this tall gray building. Now, that is Boeing's World Headquarters. But it's also our first example of a series of buildings that we're going to see on our western shore that are built on what are called air rights. Now, Abraham Lincoln was the lawyer that represented the Central Illinois Railroad in fighting for these air rights. And here's how this works. The train companies, they own the tracks and the land that they're on. They also own the air above the tracks. And they lease that air to developers to develop buildings. Now, you'll notice the Boeing building is essentially built on a platform, and this platform serves as a tunnel to allow trains access underneath the building. Now, normally when you construct a building, you put caissons into the ground, you build up, and you support your building from below. And that's what they did in the tower section of this building. They couldn't do that underneath the southern section because underneath there are switching tracks, and they're consolidating train lines, and there's just no room for columns in between the tracks. So instead, they cantilevered or balanced this section of the building off the tower. And you'll notice right along the river's edge, those columns right there. Now, those are not actually load-bearing columns. Those are just for show. Because instead, that section of the building is hanging from above. And as you come out underneath the bridge here, take a look over your shoulder. You're going to see this steel truss fully exposed above the top of the building. So that section of the building is hanging from above, off that steel truss, instead of being supported by columns from below. Now on our right here, we've got 2 North Riverside Plaza. This is the old Daily News building. It's an Art Deco style building. And you'll notice right along the river's edge, those obelisks with the lights on them. Now, it's very common for Art Deco to have Middle Eastern or Egyptian motifs kind of married together. And that's because when Art Deco was becoming popular in the 1920s, it's also about the time they first discovered King Tut's tomb. And ever since, Middle Eastern or Egyptian motifs have been married together with Art Deco. Now we're entering the financial district of downtown. It's on both sides of our boat. But on our western shore, we've got a series of buildings that collectively make up what is known as the Gateway Center. So this is Gateway Center number 1. Its identical twin is Gateway Center number 2. And then there's that tall white building right there, that's Gateway Center number 3. And then beyond it, there's that glass building down there, which is named Reginald. No, guys, it's not named Reginald. It's not even Reggie. Now, if you picked up on the pattern, you realize it's Gateway Center number 4. Guys, I will have no child left behind at my home. And that includes all of you. So if any of you are having problems counting, please see when we get back to God. I will not leave you behind. I will help you with that. Okay, so back to our tour over here. Now, back to Gateway Center number 2. Now, this is another example of that modern or international style of architecture which was made popular by Mies van der Rohe, but we did not design these. These were designed by Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, the same people that did the Sears Tower. But you'll see this style of building all over Chicago and really pretty much all over the world. And part of the reason why they call it international style is because it's set with it being so plain and simple on the outside. You can take that style of building, construct it in any city, on any continent, anywhere in the world, and it will fit in with its surroundings because it's so plain and simple on the outside. Now on our right over here, we've reached Union Station. That's one of 4 train stations in the downtown area. And then just off to our starboard bow here, we've got that square building with the X's on the outside, affectionately known as the Xbox, for obvious reasons. But it's also designed by Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, who also designed the John Hancock Tower, which also has X's on the outside. Now the X's are called cross bracers. And in the case of the John Hancock Tower, they are there to give extra strength and support to the building. But in this case, they are literally supporting the roof of the building. And by putting your support on the outside like that, that means on the inside, you have a larger floor plate and more flexibility with how you use your floor space, because you don't have all those columns getting in the way. Now right here, this is Gateway Center number 4. And it's another example of postmodernism. If you look up to the roof, you'll notice there's that curve up there, because there's a curve near the water. You'll also notice the mirror effect, literally reflecting the building surrounding it. And the mirror is tinted green. And the mirror is green because the water is green. Now, a lot of people then ask, why is the water green? It's because we dye for St. Patrick's Day. Well, we do dye the water for St. Patrick's Day. It's a tradition we've had since the 1960s. The Plumbers Union is responsible for it to put a completely natural vegetable-based dye in the water, which they normally use to try to find leaks in plumbing. But it does turn the water a very unnatural color green. And it looks fantastic on St. Patrick's Day. But that's not why the water's green. The water's green because we cleaned up the water. So that means light can penetrate to the bottom. It's flat and sandy, about 25 feet deep. There's a thin layer of algae growing on the bottom. So when the light reaches the bottom, it reflects off that green algae and returns to us as the color green. Now this massive old building on our right, that is the old Central Post Office for Chicago. It's designed by Graham Anderson Post and White, the same people that did the Wrigley buildings, which we saw a little bit earlier. But when that first opened, it was the world's largest post office. And you might be a little curious as to why do we need such a large post office? And that's because Chicago is the home of the catalog industry. Businesses like Sears, JCPenney, Montgomery Ward, they all used to send out catalogs right from that building. And then, of course, you could order just about anything out of those catalogs. So you could order clothing, housewares, toys, even a house. And they would literally ship you the house in pieces, along with everything else on those catalogs and the rest of Chicago's mail, right out of that building. But as you can see, that building is huge. It's very tall. It's very wide. And it was very inefficient at sorting mail. Now, it has since been decommissioned by the post office. They no longer use it, but it is considered a national landmark, so we can't just knock it down. But a few months ago, a developer unveiled plans to turn that into a mixed-use facility, including hotels, apartments, shops, restaurants, possibly a casino, and maybe even a 2,000-foot tall tower addition, making it the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere. Now, we'll see if any of that actually gets built, because they've been trying to redevelop this building for close to 2 decades now. But if you've ever seen the movie Batman: The Dark Knight, You know that opening scene where the Joker's up on the roof about to rob the bank? The roof that he's on is the roof of the old post office. And the bank that he robs is the lobby that's inside of that old post office. Now, of course, when you close a post office, you have to open up a replacement. And this is its replacement right here. This opened up in 1996 and uses modern technology to be a lot more efficient in its ability to sort and deliver mail. But, funny story about this post office. They designed it so that postal vehicles could drive through it for loading and unloading. Makes a lot of sense. But unfortunately, when they constructed the building, they built the roof line a fraction of an inch too low. So the roof of the trucks were too tall to drive underneath the roof of the building and drive inside of it. So in order to get those trucks into the building, they had to let the air out of the tires. Now they have since fixed that problem. They can now drive through the building as intended. But it's always good to know that your tax dollars weren't being wasted. Now this interesting looking building, you might recognize as looking similar to the Corncom Towers, which we saw a little bit earlier, designed by Bertrand Goldberg. This is also designed by Bertrand. In fact, anytime you're in Chicago, if you see a curvy concrete building, it's Bertrand Goldberg. But just like Marina City Towers, it's also meant to be a city within a city. So there's retail down below, residential up above. And if you looked at this building from above, you'd see it's shaped like a giant letter S. And at the one end of the building right there, there's that glass column. And that's actually an atrium that runs right down the center of the building. And when you're on the inside, you can look across the atrium to your neighbor across the way. But the original intention with this design, when it was done back in the early 1980s, was to have 1.5 miles of buildings, just like this one, serpentining their way down along the river's edge, down to Chinatown. But back then, there just wasn't enough demand for housing in this part of town, so they never actually did build those additional buildings. But if you've ever seen the movie Stranger Than Fiction, starring Will Ferrell and Emma Thompson, Will Ferrell's character lives inside of this building, and you can actually get to see what it looks like on the inside in that movie. Now in just a moment here, we are going to be turning around. We're going to head back north. We're still in the south branch of the river, but as you can see, it's shaping up to be a pretty nice day out here today. And you know, there's one thing that I can think of that would brighten it up even more, and that would be an ice cold beverage in my hand. And just talk to Eric right back there. He can fix you up with one, whatever you need for the remainder of our tour. But as we are getting ready to turn around, I'd like to call your attention to our western shore. You'll notice there's this parking structure over there. And then just to the right of the parking structure, you can see there's that crane, and then just beyond it, there's that radio antenna with a blinking red beacon. And I'm pointing out to you the radio antenna because where the antenna is located, that's where the Fire Academy is located. And it's appropriate that the Fire Academy would be right there, because it's built on the site of where the Great Chicago Fire started. Now, you may have heard this story about the Great Chicago Fire. It's a pretty popular one. It goes something like this. There was a nice old woman by the name of Mrs. O'Leary. She went out one night to milk her cow. So she took her lantern with her. And as she was milking the cow got excited and knocked over the lantern, which caught some straw on fire, which caught her barn on fire, which then burned down the entire city. Now, we did have the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. We burned 4 square miles of the downtown area, left 1/3 of our population homeless, burned over 17,000 buildings, and left only a handful of them standing. It was devastating. But that story is completely false. That was actually made up by a newspaper reporter who reported the story as fact in order to sell more newspapers. Now, the truth of the matter is, we'll probably never really know what started the Great Chicago Fire. They now think that maybe it was gamblers that were out back doing some gambling. Maybe they knocked over a lantern, but it's anyone's guess as to what really happened. But poor Mrs. O'Leary, she was a real live person, and she was blamed. And she died penniless and ostracized by the public here in Chicago. It's actually a very sad story. And it was when the newspaper reporter was on his deathbed that he admitted that he made the whole thing up. But of course, by then, Mrs. O'Leary had long ago passed on, and the story has stuck around to become popular folklore. But you might be a little curious and wondering, okay, Todd, great tour.